Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm going to read Cranford chapter 5, Your Ladyship. One morning before 12 o'clock, Mother came up and said that Miss Betty Barker would like to speak to her mistress. Miss Matty disappeared to change her cap and Miss Barker came upstairs apologizing again and again for her visit. Miss Betty Barker was the daughter of the late Mr. Jaggins Clark. She and her elder sister, who had worked for Mrs. Jamieson, had been ladies' maid. Later, they had a hat shop with Lady Alley as a customer. When the sister died, Miss Betty shut the shop and became the most wonderfully dressed lady in Cranford, wearing all the bonnets and caps and ribbons that were left on her shelves. And now Miss Betty Barker had called to invite Miss Matty to tea on the following Tuesday. She had already invited the Honorable Mrs. Jamieson, she said. She invited me too, though she was clearly worried that, as my father had gone to live in Dramber, he was now in that awful cotton trade. Miss Barker's own days in trade had finished several years ago, and she now liked to think of herself as one of the ladies of Cranford, though she was always very respectful towards the best families. Mrs. Jamieson is coming? Asked Miss Matty. Yes, it's most kind of ladies such as Mrs. Jamieson and yourself to call on someone like myself. Miss Barker began to apologize again. She was now going, she told Miss Matty, to see Mrs. Forrester and Miss Poole. Of course, I invited you first, madam, as a Ratter's daughter, but we must not forget that Mrs. Forrester is related to the biggest of Bigelow Hall. So I shall invite her before I invite Miss Poole. And Mrs. Fitzadam asked Miss Matty. No, madam, I have great respect for Miss Fitzadam, but Mrs. Jamieson would not like to meet her, I think. Miss Barker rose. Will you come to my little house at 6:30? Miss Matilda? That is when Mrs. Jamieson had promised to come. Miss Betty Barker curtsied and laughed. Mrs. Fitzadam was the sister of Mr. Hoggins, the Cranford daughter. Their parents were respectable farmers, but they did not belong to Cranford society. When Miss Mary Hoggins married Mr. Fitzadam, whoever he was, she left the town. Then, after his death, she reappeared as a widow in black silk and rented a large old house. I remember that the ladies of Cranford met to discuss whether they should visit her. The matter has still not been decided when Miss Jaggins died. However, as most of us are either unmarried or widows without children, Miss Poole had said, we'll soon have no society at all. We don't change our rules a little. So everybody called on Mrs. Fitzadam. Everybody except Mrs. Jamieson, who was related, of course, to the family of a lord. She used to show how important she was by never seeing or speaking to Mrs. Fitzadam when they met at the Cranford parties. Mrs. Fitzadam was large, and when Mrs. Jamieson came in, she always took up and cast very low, but Mrs. Jamieson stayed did not see her. It was a bright spring evening when the four of us, Miss Matty, Mrs. Forrester, Miss Poole, and myself, met outside Miss Barker's house. We heard loud whispers inside. Wait, Peggy. Wait until I've run upstairs. Then, when I cough, open the door. The cough came. Immediately a maid opened the door and showed us into a small room that had been the shop. We uncovered our caps and shook our skirts. Then we walked up the narrow stairs to Miss Parker's drawing room. Kind, gentle Mrs. Forrester was given the second place of honor. The first place, of course, was for the Honorable Mrs. Jamieson, who soon came heavily up the stairs. And now Miss Betty Parker was proud, happy woman. Peggy, the maid, came in with a generous trayful of cake. Did the ladies think this vulgar? I wondered. Clearly they did not. All the cake disappeared. I saw Mrs. Jamieson eat 3 pieces slowly with an expression not unlike a clown's. After tea, the ladies played cards, all except myself. I was rather afraid of the Cranford ladies at cards, and Mrs. Jamieson, who fell asleep in her armchair. I enjoyed watching the 4 ladies' caps at the card table and hearing Miss Parker, "Shh, lady, please. Miss Jamieson is asleep." Then the door opened. Mrs. Jamieson woke up and Peggy came in with another trayful of good things. We did not usually eat supper, but politely, not hungrily, we gave in. We even accepted a little drink. Certainly, Mrs. Jamieson gave us some news. My sister-in-law, Lady Glanmere, is coming to stay with me. Indeed? Said everyone. Then there was a pause. Did we have the right dresses in which to appear before Lady Glanmere? We felt very excited and unsure. Not long after this, the little party came to an end. Mrs. Jamieson got into her carriage and the rest of us walked home along the quiet little street. At 12 next day, Miss Poole appeared at Miss Maddie's. What should we call Lady Glanmere? She asked anxiously. Must we say your ladyship instead of just you? And my lady instead of madam? You knew Lady Early, Miss Maddie? What did you call her? Poor Miss Maddie, she took off her glasses and she put them on again, that she could not remember. It was so long ago, she said, and I only ever saw her twice. Oh dear, how stupid I am. Then I would better go and ask Mrs. Forrester, said Miss Poole. We don't want Lady Glanmere to think we know nothing about polite society here in Cranford. Who is Lady Glanmere exactly? I asked when Miss Poole had gone. My dear, she is the widow of Lord Glanmere, and he was Mr. Jamieson's elder brother. But I wonder what we should call her. Miss Maddie's worrying was unnecessary. Mrs. Jamieson was the next person who arrived, and Mrs. Jamieson most impolitely made it clear that she did not wish the Cranford ladies to visit her sister-in-law. Well, said Miss Poole, who returned soon afterwards very red and annoyed. So we must not call on Lady Glanmere. Only the best county families are acceptable visitors, and Cranford society is not good enough, it seems. Yes, I met Mrs. Jamieson on her way from here to Mrs. Forrester's, and she told me. I wish I would have said something sharp. Who is this Lady Glanmere anyway? Only the widow of a Scottish lord and the fit daughter of son Mr. Campbell. Miss Poole, usually so kind and calm, was really annoyed, and I ordered a new cab this morning in order to be quite ready. When we came out of church on Lady Glanmere's first Sunday in Cranford, we carefully turned our backs on Mrs. Jamieson and her sister-in-law, We did not even look at Lady Glanmere, though we very much wanted to know what she was like. Afterwards, we questioned Mother, however, and Mother had used her eyes well. The little lady was Mrs. Jamieson, you mean? She was wearing a rather old black silk dress, and she had bright black eyes. She looked up and down the church like a bird and lifted her skirts when she came out very quick and sharp. She's more like the landlady at the George Inn than a real lady. Shh, mother, said Miss Maddie. That is not respectful. Another Sunday passed, and we stayed 10 away from two widows. By this time, Lady Glanmere was perhaps getting a little bored at Mrs. Jamieson's. Whatever the reason, Mrs. Jamieson certainly sent us invitations to a small party. Her man, Molina, brought them himself, coming as usual to the front door instead of to the back like other servants. Miss Maddie and I quietly decided not to accept ours, but before we had replied, Miss Poole arrived. The invitation is for Tuesday, Miss Maddie told her. If you bring your knighting and drink tea with us that evening, I will have a good reason to refuse. I saw Miss Poole's expression change. You are not going? Oh, Miss Maddie, you must go. We can't let Mrs. Jamieson think we care about anything she says. I'm ready to forgive and forget. As a Ratter's daughter, you should do the same. The fact was that Miss Poole had a new cap and wanted to wear it. So, in the end, Miss Maddie bought a new cap too, and so did Mrs. Forrester, and we all went to Mrs. Jamieson's party. Mrs. Jamieson's drawing room was not a comfortable room. Neither she nor Molina, of whom she seemed a little afraid, did anything to make us feel welcome. Lady Glanmere arranged the chairs agreeable for us, however. Now that we could look at her, we saw that she was a bright little woman of middle age, who had been very pretty when she was young. We were all silent at first, and sure what to say to my lady. At last Miss Poole spoke. Has your ladyship seen the dear queen lately? She asked, and looked proudly round at us. I've never seen her in my life, said Lady Glanmere in sweet Scottish voice. In fact, I've only been to London twice. Have you been to Edinburgh? She asked hopefully. None of us had, but Miss Poole had an uncle who once passed a night there, so that was very pleasant. Mrs. Jamieson meanwhile began to wonder aloud why Molina did not bring in the tea, but she did not want to trouble Molina by ringing the bell. In the end, Lady Glanmere grew quite impatient and rang the bell herself. Molina appeared, looking surprised. Lady Glanmere ran, said Mrs. Jamieson. I believe it was for tea. Tea came at last. The plates were very thin and fine, so was the bread and butter. We were grateful to Lady Glanmere for ordering more of it, and comfortable conversation developed. Soon the ladies were playing cards happily together. Even Miss Poole quite forgot to say my lady and your ladyship. We learned during the evening that Lady Glanmere had no plans to return quickly to Edinburgh. We were rather glad. We liked her. Isn't walking very unpleasant? Asked Mrs. Jamieson as we prepared to leave. This was a regular question for her, as she had a carriage and never walked anywhere. Oh no, not at night, said Miss Poole. Such peace after excitement of a party, said Mrs. Forrester. The stars are so beautiful, said Miss Maddie. So we walked home under the stars, feeling grand after drinking tea with my lady. My dears, said Miss Poole next day, very pleased. Did you notice her dress? So inexpensive. Okay, finished. That is Cranford chapter 5. Your Ladyship. See you next podcast. Thank you so much for your kind listening.